the ban worked tremendously well. For one thing, there's no possibility of smuggling. Well, I shouldn't say no possibility. It's very difficult to smuggle a whole container of scrap metal. Scrap metal is not easily hidden. So even worldwide, the smuggling trade in scrap metal is very small. And once you ban the exports, there is very little local market for scrap metal anyway. So the ban effectively shuts down the industry, at least compared to the scale on which it used to operate. As a result, once a ban was implemented, exports plummeted, and along with it, reporting of scrap metal theft also plummeted. Why is that not the end of the story? If this is a big problem, it has enormous social cost in terms of the cost of scrap metal theft. And it is going to continue to get worse worldwide. Why is not the ban that we have instituted the end of the story? Because the scrap metal industry does some good, does a lot of good. For one thing, the scrap metal industry creates value like every other industry. Every other industry, whether it is taking a green banana from some roadside in St. Mary to being a ripe banana on your supermarket shelf where it has greater value, that production creates wealth, and that is the wealth that we enjoy. Similarly, to take, just ignoring the problem of theft for a moment, to take scrap metal from a landfill or from side of the road that I drive past, and to be able to take it to where it can have value is a wealth creating activity. So in the absence of the externality of scrap metal theft, it's an industry we want to have just like any other. And along the way, it provides employment. Many of you may have more formal notions of employment. We economists are a little more liberal in our interpretation of employment. It provides employment for many who collect scrap and resell it to dealers and brokers. And as a bonus, it also reduces what we deposit in our landfills. And the landfills are already a problem. So this is not a bad industry to have if we can find a way to deal with the problem. So Capri's research went searching for a way to deal with the problem. And having discovered that this is a worldwide problem, we equally well discovered that there are a range and variety of solutions that different countries in the world have tried. At the present time, if you go state by state, there are some 81 scrap metal bills making its way through various legislatures in the United States. There are measures in Canada, there are measures in Russia. Some states in Russia have banned the export of scrap metal. There are a variety of approaches that are being used in Europe. And so we were able to really look at the different approaches that have been used and the different kinds of measures and which ones were successful and which ones were not. Looked at the ones that had bans, looked at the ones that instituted record keeping, looked at the ones that tried different kinds of regulations, and collected all that information and tried to sift through to get a measure, to get an idea of what were the best practices for a problem for which there were many, many examples to look at. Now we already have existing legislation, an existing legislative framework to govern the industry. It is the Trade Scrap Metal Act of 2007. And when we looked at the requirements of the Act against our list of best practices, our conclusion was that this is not a bad act at all. What it provides for is a basis for managing the scrap metal industry. Amongst other things, it requires the licensing of dealers. It imposes a restriction on the hours within which the trade can take place, mainly daylight hours. It requires, I should say, dealers to keep records, to have control sheets that record all of the scrap that passes through the dealers. It provides for notice. Dealers are required to notify the Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce 7 days prior to a shipment, and to notify the commanding officer at the police station closest to the dealer 3 days before a shipment, to give an opportunity for inspection. Further, the Act provides that dealers must have written authorization in order to export certain sensitive items, which includes manhole covers, copper wires, railway lines, and a much longer list that we don't need to itemize here. And it imposes a requirement that containers be inspected by both customs and the police before being exported. Finally, the Act not only requires that dealers be licensed, but you need to get a license for each shipment of scrap metal. All of which not only is a reasonable list of requirements, when it was passed in 2007, it resulted in a significant drop in both exports of scrap metal and theft of metal. So the Act did go some way towards addressing the problem. Why did the problem remain? Well, not only did the problem remain, but the problem shortly after 2007 started to grow again quite impressively, as we saw in the chart at the beginning, where exports of scrap metal increased by a factor of 4 in the space of 2 years. There were two problems. One problem was that many of the provisions of the Act were not being enforced. Very often, there were no inspections of the scrap metal that was to be exported prior to it being packed in the container. An inspection may take place of the container once it is packed, but then it's more difficult to have a thorough inspection if it is already in the container. Why? Well, Customs says they don't have the capacity to be able to provide a customs officer to do inspections at all the sites prior to packing. Moreover, there are a large number of registered sites. So many shipments took place without inspection. There was no requirement that the victims of most of the metal theft, which were the utility companies, be present at any of these inspections. There was also packing that was allowed at unregistered sites. The law provided for the registration of sites, but did not entirely preclude that permission could be granted for packing at unregistered sites. So much of that took place, and it increased the burden on customs to be able to inspect at so many sites. And often the police were not present during packing. In addition to the enforcement problem, based on lack of capacity, not only by customs but by the police as well, there are what we can say are gaps in the regulation, that even though the existing framework goes a far way, it doesn't quite go far enough. For one thing, it doesn't provide for any regulation of the dealers at the point of purchase. All the regulation has to do with when it comes time to export, but nothing governs the point of purchase of the scrap from the persons who supply the dealers. And secondly, because the inspection regime was thin, generally one customs officer, it really made it quite easy for any collusion to take place. So, with these insights and with the benefit of worldwide experience, we have come up with 10 measures that we feel quite confident can be a basis on which the scrap metal industry can be reopened subject to what we are going to propose. And I ask you to consider them.